Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Please welcome Delegate Steve Heretick from Portsmouth. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you again, Woody. Welcome to the 2020 session.
Yes, it's been exciting already. We're in, the third week now?
It only seems like the third month, but yeah, we're in the third week, and I tell you, we're off to a very busy start.
So tell us what the transition has been like in terms of leadership and the Democrats now having control of the House.
Well, we're still coming up to speed. I mean, with the new Speaker, Eileen Fillicorn, we've seen a lot of changes with committee structures. We've seen some committees reorganized and renamed. Of course, all the committee leadership is new. So, we're continuing to work through that process. But I'll tell you, as steep of a learning curve as it is, we're moving along very, very quickly, and I think we're confident that we'll get everything we need to do done by crossover.
And you are vice chair of counties, cities, and towns, but
right.
You also chair 3 subcommittees.
Right. I chair Woody subcommittees on cities, counties, and towns, and I do the local land use planning aspects. I chair a subcommittee on on finance, where I do local taxation and tax policy at municipal level. And I also chair a committee on labor and commerce, where we primarily focus on insurance and health insurance related issues. So it's keeping me jumping.
A little subtle name change there, labor and commerce. It used to be the reverse.
Used to be commerce and labor, and 4 out of 5 times I will still make the mistake, but yeah.
So how's Portsmouth doing, especially since sequestration has been lifted?
Well, listen, Portsmouth is always very dependent upon the defense industry, as its economic base. Portsmouth also relies a lot on ports and international trade. So sequestration has been a concern. Obviously, the president's trade tariffs have created some issues for us. But as a whole, I think Portsmouth is really beginning to move forward. We see a lot of very fresh residential development in the city. We see a lot of businesses that are really interested in locating in Portsmouth as a way of participating more closely with the ports and international trade. I think it's poised to really make some fairly significant moves in the next few years. And I can tell you, I'm working closely with Mayor John Rowe and the City Council to help bring that to fruition here in Richmond.
And of course, your transportation needs are still significant.
They haven't really changed. I mean, we still have the tolls on the downtown and midtown tunnel, which continue to cause us, a lot of economic problems and continue to sort of hold down some of the economic development we were hoping that would locate in Portsmouth. I would tell you, on a good note, that we're working, I think, very, very well with Secretary Shannon Valentine, the Virginia Secretary of Transportation, and helping to identify some fiscal strategies to help deal with some of the tolling issues. And I think it's nice to see, because I think when that problem first developed, Portsmouth was seen as essentially standing alone in the Commonwealth in dealing with tolls. But now, as we see tolling as much more of a widespread transportation funding initiative, there are other localities that begin to understand what our experience means to us. And they're a lot more willing, I think, to work with us as we work with them in terms of trying to identify strategies to help avoid tolls or minimize tolls. And I think that really comes to our benefit.
And of course, that strategy is now being employed on the I-81 corridor.
Well, I-81, obviously, in the western part of Virginia, they want expansions, much needed expansions, I certainly will admit, to help make that roadway safer. I think anyone who's ever spent a day going a mile on I-81 will tell you that the sheer volume of traffic, particularly commercial traffic, is makes it a very unsafe roadway. It badly is overdue for expansion. But the problem is that the localities along I-81 don't want to pay tolls. So we're looking at alternatives such as higher gas taxes along that corridor and some other regional tax increases to help pay for that. But at the same time, when they're asking for us to make improvements, so to support improvements on I-81, I tend to remind them that we have improvements that we need to be paid for in Portsmouth and Norfolk.
What about Smart Scale? Does it need to be tweaked at all?
I think Smart Scale is actually working very nicely. I think we can all agree to disagree sometimes with the priorities that they finally identified, but I think what Smart Scale really has done, and I think Secretary Lane has been a chief proponent of Smart Scale, is that it has really removed a lot of the politics from the conversation. In former days, certainly as you know, transportation projects were largely governed and driven by who had seniority on Transportation Committee, Appropriations Committee, and similar things. Here, we know from independent sources, Commonwealth Transportation Board and other similar organizations, what as an objective, nonpartisan priority we can expect to see. And to some extent, I think it's been helpful because, again, it takes out some of the uncertainty. It saves one locality from sort of bumping another in line for transportation infrastructure improvements. And I think that it helps make our funding a little bit more predictable in that process. And at the end of the day, we got to pay for this. So to anything that helps us stabilize and make more predictable our revenue and how we have to spend it, I think is very, very helpful in that. So I'm a big fan of Smart Scale.
Speaking of additional revenue, the governor's budget includes a proposal to raise the gas tax.
Yeah, and I can tell you that is being met with some issues in some localities. I've long said that while North Carolina, our neighbor to the south, has significantly higher gas taxes, what you won't see when you go to North Carolina are significantly higher gas prices. So I think that tells us that within the profit margin that we see in a local gallon of gas, there might be some ability there to meaningfully raise some tax revenue, which we need, without raising the price of gas. And I think we're cautious, but we're exploring it. We certainly don't want to see gas prices going up in the Commonwealth because that leads to inflation and some other problems. But at the same time, if North Carolina can get, I believe it's 14 cents more tax dollars in every gallon of gas it sells than we can, and their gas prices are more or less the same as ours, it tells me that we're leaving an awful lot of potential revenue on the table, and that's not fair to our taxpayers.
And there's no question but that those revenues have been eroded as a result of technology.
Well, and certainly one of the, I guess, the good problems to have is that a lot of our tax structure was based upon, predicated upon gas taxes. Well, now that we see vehicles becoming more energy efficient, we have hybrid cars and so forth, the revenues that were projected for to be paid for by gas taxes are actually decreasing, which again adds to the overall strain of raising the revenues that we need to pay for roads and similar improvements. So I think we're a victim of our own success in pushing energy efficient vehicles, and I think we do have to look at alternative ways because let's face it, every project that everybody wants costs money. And one thing you learn very quickly here in the Assembly is nothing is free. And trying to make sure that we have stable, predictable, and fair sources of revenue is what drives our ability to operate everything from schools to local government to health care and so forth. And unfortunately, taxation is a fact of life. Nobody likes to pay taxes. But as long as it's done fairly, as long as it's done equitably, I think that's really what we're striving for here.
What about a mileage-based regime based upon GPS devices in cars?
Well, that's actually been a proposal of the Secretary of Transportation, and I think that the technology that would drive our ability to tax in that way is fairly new. It's an interesting idea. I frankly have not had a good opportunity to really explore that very intensively, but I think it's an innovative concept. And one of the things I do like about the Northam administration, I would tell you, is that they are certainly willing to think outside the box to help us identify, new potential solutions to the various problems that we have, and that's, I think, a good example of one.
Now, I take it that we continue to make significant investments into the Port of Virginia.
Listen, I think that's probably, one of the things that we should be proudest of here in the Assembly. If you remember, 10, not even 12 years ago, we were on the cusp of selling the Port of Virginia to, frankly, let's call it what it is, the Chinese. We now know that 10% of the trade in Virginia and the jobs in Virginia are driven by the ports of Virginia. And that's a very big statement because, let's face it, the ports of Virginia are in Norfolk, Portsmouth, to some extent Newport News, and Front Royal. So four very limited areas bring in 10% of the state's GNP. That's not a little thing. When the General Assembly decided that we were not going to sell the ports, we decided that we had to put substantial capital investment to make our ports world class, and we've done exactly that. In the past, I'm thinking 4 years, the state has invested nearly $1 billion to bring new technology to Norfolk International Terminal, to help upgrade Virginia International Gateway in Portsmouth, which is probably one of the cutting-edge ports in the world, and very importantly, perhaps most importantly, to deepen and widen our channel depth so that we can accommodate the very largest freight ships in the world, which we currently do, and to stay ahead of our competition in New York and Savannah, Charleston. And I think that kind of forward thinking, and frankly, given the return on investment that we see, to get the ROI that we do on the funds that we have appropriated and the upgrades that have been made, I think that's what serves Virginia extremely well. And I think that's a success story we will be able to talk about for many years to come.
Yeah, because the secretaries of transportation have had the foresight to see what was happening in the Panama Canal early on,
right,
in order to make our port deeper and wider even.
Well, and we have advantages in Hampton Roads that New York certainly doesn't have and Savannah, Charleston doesn't have in terms of our natural depth. Because again, the bigger the ships you get, sort of the deeper that they have to go. And so we have a natural advantage that way, but we have to stay ahead of that curve. Because again, the ships are continuing to get larger. Just when you think that they can't, they do. So in other words, we can accommodate the current largest classes of ships in Virginia now, which contain about 17,000, if you can imagine that, 17,000 TEUs, or those tractor-trailer containers we see. Right. So when you think about how many trucks that takes off our roads, just by that is an amazing number. But there are ships going to be coming out in the next few years which will take 22 to 25,000 TEUs. So we have to be ready for that. And already the ports of Virginia are what our shippers call first in, first out. So the first time they hit the United States, they will stop with us in Virginia and offload the first of their cargo simply to lighten the ship so they can actually get into other harbors. And then as they're taking loads, out of the country for export, they will stop in the Port of Virginia last to take on the last of their freight so that they can actually get out. And what that does, it makes us, I think, the preferred port for a good many of the major, local consumers, the Walmarts, of the world and in the United States. So we're buying products from abroad. We're the first point of impact that they get in the United States. And then for shippers who have time-sensitive cargo, we're the last out. So I think it really positions the Port of Virginia to be much more aggressive in terms of its ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with New York, which is currently still the largest production port in the United States. But then again, they have a lot more port facilities in New York than we do. We're just much more efficient. We're more readily available to the sea. And I think we're a little bit more user-friendly in our ability to move freight in and out. So I think it's a pretty big success story for us.
And of course, the widening project is not only to accommodate commercial traffic, but we've got a lot of naval traffic in there as well.
Well, and a lot of people look at Hampton Roads and they think, well, we've got all this water, why can't we fit ships through? Well, the problem we have is that the channel depth, which will accommodate significantly large freighters, is the same channel that has to accommodate aircraft carriers. And the two of those ships passing, by side by side, or a beam, as they say, it kind of narrows things down. So in order to make sure that we can accommodate the Navy without interruption and our freight traffic without interruption, all we're doing is widening what's there and taking it down a few more feet so that, again, we can anticipate what's coming in the future and, we can keep everybody on the move.
Now, you mentioned Front Royal. I don't think many people know much about the inland port there,
Right.
which is a huge distribution center.
It is. And I think it's one of the unknown success stories. I mean, partnering with, a city that is so far removed from the water, people say, well, what does that do? Well, what it does do is we can take by and ship by rail, a lot of the freight coming into the ports of Hampton Roads. And remember where Front Royal is located. It's within about an hour, not even of Washington, Baltimore. 2 hours to Philadelphia. I mean, in terms of the major urban, consumer centers in the Northeast, it's very strategically located. So we can take freight in from the Port of Virginia, ship it by rail to Front Royal in less than a day, and have it distributed to Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia in the same day. And that to us gives us tremendous distribution advantage over some of our competing states. And let's be honest. States compete with each other for economic development. We compete with each other for revenue. And I think just like any other business, Virginia has to be on the forefront of that, because what it does do, it keeps us, keeps our people working, it keeps us in jobs. It helps keep our tax base low, and it gives us the expanding revenue stream that we need to do more in terms of, providing for our teachers, providing for our schools, for example, without going to the taxpayer and saying you have to pay more. So I think it's kind of a win for everybody.
To what extent is sea level rise and climate change a real threat to commercial business, to the population in general, and to the Navy?
I am very glad that you asked that. I think for entirely too long, the fact of sea level rise, let's face it, has been overlooked by previous members of the General Assembly as if it were some sort of fake kind of news. The fact of the matter is the Navy identified years ago the problems of sea level rise in Norfolk. And remember that the Norfolk Naval Base is the single largest military installation of its kind in the world. We have 5 carrier task forces that base there. We have submarine fleets. We have destroyers. We have 60,000 military personnel and an air capacity. And for sea level rise to even come up 6 feet could jeopardize our ability to host that facility in Virginia at all, which would be a tremendous loss to all of us, not just in terms of the neighbors we have in the military, but in terms of the economic impact that the Navy brings to our region, which is measured in the tens of billions of dollars every year. So sea level rise, as we continue to see in Hampton Roads, is an increasing problem. When I first moved to Hampton Roads back in the early 90s, we would see these so-called 100-year storms maybe every 5, 6, 7 years. Today we see them 2 or 3 times a year.
Wow.
And what it does, it blocks streets, it blocks railways, it blocks our ability to move throughout the region. And anybody who says it's not real doesn't live where we do. I think the more emphasis that we can put on addressing that problem, and the more support that we can put behind addressing it is absolutely needed for the future of our region.
How are we addressing the needs of our veterans? I know you have a lot of your constituents who are veterans. I think they're, 10% of the population in the Commonwealth?
Well, of the Commonwealth, but I think in our region it's nearly a quarter. Yeah. Because let's face it, I mean, if you've been in the Navy, you've been in the Marine Corps, you've been in the Army, I mean, chances are you've been in Hampton Roads at some point in your career. And we see, Coast Guard, I can't forget that, because most of my neighbors are Coasties. But, we have a lot of retirees, a lot of folks who, have retired and gone back into civilian service. We have to take care of those folks. And I think that one of the important things that, I think Governor McAuliffe really started it, but Governor Northam certainly has weighed in, is providing, Virginia Veterans Affairs to supplement, the Federal Veterans Administration. And we help, do such things as providing veterans, job opportunities. We talk about sort of augmenting their health care access. We do some of the very critical things that the Federal Veterans Administration has been criticized for too long about failing to do in certain respects. We're trying to pick up that slack for our folks. And I can tell you that with the opening of veteran centers in Virginia Beach, I believe there's a clinic in Norfolk that's talking to open. I know that they're talking about trying to open a facility over in Portsmouth, Chesapeake, at a location they're still working on. It's trying to bring home to our neighborhoods those veteran services that up to now people have sometimes had to drive long distances to get a hold of. And also, Secretary Hopkins, Carlos Hopkins, I think, has been very, very responsive in trying to give as much online access to veterans as he possibly can to help make sure that those benefits are readily available without going physically to an office and filling out papers. Now you can go online without having to leave your home. And I think Virginia can be very, very proud of the measures that we've taken to help serve the veterans who've served us.
Is that part of the Virginia Values Veterans Program, all of those things you talked about?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you used the term, because I think that when you have a nice alliteration like Virginia Values Veterans, it's easy to remember, but I think it's very important because it reflects what our true values are in terms of supporting the men and women who've worn the uniform. And again, they are a lot of my constituents, and I'm really, really proud of them.
Now, one of the major issues that I believe is in the Privileges and Elections Committee relates to the resolution that was voted out favorably last year to create an independent redistricting commission. Right. There are a lot of concerns about it. There's some people who may or may not vote for it this time around. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I wish my crystal ball was that good. But I can tell you that the discussion last year, and as certainly our viewers know, in order to make a constitutional amendment in Virginia, it has to pass the General Assembly twice in exactly the same form, and it has to pass our voters by referendum.
Does there have to be an intervening election between the passage?
Yes, and we've seen that. Yes. That's happened.
Okay.
So I think that the proposal that came out last year in terms of creating a nonpartisan redistricting commission was not a perfect bill. But I can say, somewhat facetiously, I don't know that I've seen a perfect bill since I've been here. But it does do is it helps to take some of the partisanship out of the process. In other words, I as a member don't get to draw my district, as was done in time past. Now there has been some effort among some of my colleagues to say, wait a minute, we can improve on that. The problem is that the minute we try to go back and try to improve on what was done before, we knock it out of our ability to put that into the Constitution this year. Frankly, and I hate to say this because I disappoint some of my colleagues, I want to stick with what we've got, and I want to turn it to the voters in November, because ultimately they are the judges of this legislation, not us. And I do believe that we have to stick to our commitments to the voters to create a nonpartisan redistricting commission before the 2021 redistricting that will happen. Now, again, I'm not sure of the way this thing is going to swing, but I certainly made commitments to my constituents that I would try to do something about this, and I've been out there a long time in support of nonpartisan redistricting. I think what we have to do is stick to our guns on this. We have to put it to the voters in November. And let's face it, no matter what we do or how we do it, it's not going to be perfect. But I do think that it's probably the best product we can put on the table today. And I'll be honest with you, I think that the criticism that we hear about the bill is that ultimately it is the Virginia Supreme Court that will determine disputes. And there's concern that some of the justices are appointed by essentially the Republican Party. I find that somewhat troubling, because I trust our judges. I've practiced in the courts for over 30 years in Virginia. And certainly judges are products of selection process through the General Assembly, and certainly politics play a part of that. But I can honestly tell you that I don't think that there is a judge in Virginia who does not take his or her job very, very seriously. And I think if it does come to the Virginia Supreme Court, no matter who appointed the majority of those justices, we will see a fair result, because I think their dedication, their commitment to the law and not to the hands that appointed them, I think will govern. And I don't think we can sell our justices short that way.
Now, is there any way to address some of the concerns of your colleagues with enabling legislation?
There have been some ideas at legislative fixes in terms of helping to define the specific context in which the Supreme Court would have to analyze a challenge. I think that may be helpful because right now I think the scope of the Supreme Court's inquiry is a little undefined. And certainly I think it gives judges some statutory guidelines to follow. And I haven't seen specific proposals to that yet, at least none has come to the full House. But certainly I would be interested to see what those ideas look like. But again, I think that we have to trust the process that we've put in place, and we have to trust the judges that we put there to interpret it.
Of course, there's already a well-developed body of law that's been developed, at least on the federal level, that can be used as a model by the state Supreme Court.
Well, and certainly we have to observe the Voting Rights Act, for example. I mean, there's certain federal overlays that we as a state must observe. And certainly all of those current statutory frameworks, have, as complicated as they may be, will govern the decision that we make, as an assembly in deciding this issue. But certainly will help guide the court's decision, because again, I think that as we saw in the last redistricting case that was decided by the U.S. District Court, that took years to resolve. And it's almost as if they made a decision, at the last minute with only 2 years before redistricting, and we don't want to see that continue. If there are problems with redistricting, I think we need to identify them quickly. We need to be very clear about what they are, and I think we need to be very quick with, a fix to make sure that, again, our voters choose us, we don't choose them.
Got about 2 minutes left. I know we want to talk about marijuana decriminalization versus legalization.
I think that, first of all, decriminalization simply means that if you're stopped with, certain amounts of marijuana, that you cannot be criminally charged. And I think that type of legislation the time has come. We would be, I think, the 39th or 40th state in the country to decriminalize the simple possession of marijuana. We know statistically that there is vastly disparate racial enforcement of possession charges. And let's face it, I think most Virginians, and I think the vast majority of Virginians agree, that if you have a small amount of marijuana in your pocket, that should not cost you, your career opportunities. And let's face it, a conviction can stop your ability to get a security clearance, to work in public safety, to work in other certain types of public safety.
To get food stamps, for example.
Right. And even to have subsidized housing. And I think to a lot of people, that's just not fair. And I think that we will see a repeal of that this year. Legalization, I think, is a conversation whose time has come in Virginia. I will tell you that I think it's time for us to have a mature, objective conversation about legalizing marijuana in Virginia. It was part of the Attorney General's summit back right before the holidays, where we were able to bring in folks from Colorado, Massachusetts, Illinois, District of Columbia, and Maine, who have all implemented various forms of legalization, to talk with us about the experience that they have in doing that. And I think it's a conversation Virginia needs to have for the next 2 or 3 years, and I think ultimately we need to act on it.
Thanks so much for your time, Delegate Steve Heretick. Good luck.
Thanks, Woody. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.